Good morning, everybody. A reminder to silence your phones and your laptops. Please welcome your moderator, Courtney Lang.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Courtney Lang. I am Vice President of Policy for Trust Data and Technology at the Information Technology Industry Council. We are a global technology trade association that represents 80 of the world's most innovative technology companies, and all of our companies care deeply about cybersecurity. So we're really excited to be here today on day one of RSA conference to talk a little bit more about hardware security in the post-CHIPS passage era. And I am joined by three wonderful panelists to share their perspectives both from the U.S. government as well as from industry around how they are thinking about hardware security. I'll provide a couple of brief contextual remarks, and then we'll introduce everyone and we'll get right into the panel, since I know these tend to go by quickly. But thank you all for being here today. I think it's safe to say that supply chain security has been at the forefront of conversation for the better part of the last several years. It's something that is really being reflected in the way risk management is being approached across companies, but is also become increasingly important in the U.S. government and policymaking context. I would say over the past year or so, we've seen kind of a shift towards.
That was the popping sound.
Got it.
I'll go turn it up and you should be good.
Sorry, everyone. All right. Restarting. So we've seen a shift in recent years now towards the hardware security lens, especially in the post-CHIPS era. And so some of that has been encapsulated, for example, in the National Cyber Strategy, where we have seen incorporation of concepts like secure by default, secure by design. I'll let Steve talk a little bit more about that in a bit. We've seen the White House announce an effort on IoT labeling. We've seen the Department of Defense create a quantifiable assurance program for chips. We've seen cybersecurity requirements in the recent notice of funding for the CHIPS money itself. And we've also seen industry start to incorporate practices related to uplifting hardware security, things like confidential compute, for example. So with that framing, I would like to introduce my panelists. We have John Boyens to my right. He is the Deputy Chief of the Computer Science Division of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Next to him is Amit El-Azhari, Head of Cyber Policy at Intel. And down at the end, we have Steve Kelly, Senior Director of Cybersecurity and Emerging Technology with the National Security Council at the White House. So really happy to have you all here today. To start it off, like I mentioned, there's been a big focus on supply chain security over the last, several years or so. Even more recently, we've seen kind of this shift towards resiliency, particularly around semiconductors. I think with the pandemic, there was a very clear supply chain disruption. There weren't enough chips when folks needed them. And so I think some of the US government response has been focused on kind of fostering this resiliency. That being said, security goes hand in hand with resiliency, and I wanted to see if you guys could disentangle these concepts a little bit, talk about how resiliency fits into supply chain security more broadly, but also how they're different. Steve, maybe we'll start with you and go down the line.
Yeah, sure. And just to start off, I'd like to go back to the President's National Security Strategy, so not to be confused with the cyber strategy that came out recently. That strategy had 19 references to supply chain issues, and they ran the gamut. And it seems like supply chain, prior to AI kind of popping in the news recently, supply chain issues were really much in the forefront, everything from toilet paper to chips in cars. And the National Security Strategy recognizes that, but there's a couple of components of what even that means. And one is making sure that we have the stuff that we need, that our sources of the goods and the services or the components, that can be safeguarded, and we can get those supplies that we need or the items we need. And then the second is making sure that that item is safe and secure, and that that's not been co-opted in some way or is of poor quality. And so that's kind of the two bits, and in the national security strategy, you'll see kind of the references to supply chain issues covering a couple of those issues. For instance, with rare earth minerals, it's not a security issue as to whether that mineral is the mineral. It is the mineral. The question is, do we have a way to get it, a place to get it from? And the national security strategy notes, and I'll refer to my notes here because I want to get the quote right. It notes our most pressing challenges is from authoritarian powers who leverage technology and supply chains for coercion and repression, and that China is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to advance that objective. So that's the frame under which the CHIPS Act was signed, making sure that because of the national security implications of our ability to have a supply of secure technology, and to make sure that that's not being interrupted or co-opted, that we need to make sure that we have a robust manufacturing base. And so, it is in that context that CHIPS was born. And then there's additional references in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which I can get to later.
Amit?
I really appreciate that, Stephen. First of all, let me say thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're excited to be here, and this is a critical point. We are at RSA, right? This conference is about protecting the nation, protecting society. All these technologies that we are talking about, that we see are in the expo, that we are innovating and thinking about together, they're powered by compute. And the United States has recognized that we have vulnerabilities in the supply chain. And with the passage of the CHIPS Act, the most significant industrial policy action, right, since World War II in terms of bringing back this more geopolitically diverse supply chains and bringing back, advanced manufacturing to the United States, this is a very significant issue. But as we think about supply chain resilience, we cannot do that without supply chain security. What do I mean by that? This is a moment for product security. Many of you, as you walk here the floor at the expo, you hear about cloud security, you hear about IoT security, you hear about software. But all these technologies are connected and are protected by the stack. And this is an holistic stack approach. So as we think about that, it's really essential that as we are distributing those funds and are thinking about, getting that CHIPS Act, moment going, we also think about not creating a technical debt, right? Taking and leveraging this moment to really think about on how promoting hardware security. And what this means to me is collaboration. And this is what I mean when we think about, for example, IoT security and the important work, right, that is done by the National Security Council in the White House, but also in Europe as we're thinking about the next future of regulation for product security. If you haven't heard the name, you're gonna hear it here. EU Cyber Resilience Act is the most holistic, comprehensive product security regulation. It's going to be a GDPR moment for security, and this is about baseline security measures. So as we think about these approaches to protect users, we have to continue to think about the hardware. When you boot your computers, first line of defense, root of trust, right? So from my perspective, we cannot decouple supply chain resilience and security because we're not going to achieve what we need in terms of addressing the vulnerabilities in the supply chain if we bring in those chips and that is not done securely. That is architecture, quality, assurance, design, IT, and cyber. And I'm very excited because I'm going to share here something with the audience. You're getting a first announcement. Next week is my last day at Intel, and I'm starting something new. It's called Open Policy, and I'm becoming a co-founder of a company aimed at democratizing policy. But the real goal in all of this is advancing the standardization and the collaborative work that we need in order to make sure that as we think about product security, we don't fragment. And fragmentation means global regulation, but also the collaboration between different pieces of the stack. So that's what I'm excited about, and I think we're going to hear a lot more from John what this means from a technical perspective, because we already know from the notice of the proposed funding for the CHIPS Act that these best practices, these standards about hardware security, they're going to change with us as we build that next generation of the resilient supply chain.
Great. John, do you want to chime in on the broader question?
I knew we should have said differently. I don't like going after a meet. I'll bring it back to more, I wouldn't say academic, but a lower level. So supply chain risk management has been around for a while, right? It really got kicked off in 1995. Supply chains have been around for centuries. But the resilience is nothing new into supply chain risk management. Adding in the security aspects is, but we have to differentiate between securing supply chains and securing the products and services that run through those supply chains. That is where the opportunity is now, right? Particularly when we're talking about microelectronics. This is, as Amit said, I mean, this is our day. So with that said, I think we need to balance going slowly in a kind of a thoughtful manner and continuing and taking a hold of this opportunity and not getting stuck in a rut. But
Wonderful. Well, thank you for kind of differentiating the two concepts as well as offering perspective on how they're actually interrelated, and you can't really have one without the other. Steve, maybe turning to you, you mentioned the national security strategy. You also mentioned the national cybersecurity strategy. Wondering if you can share a little bit more around how the administration and the US government is thinking about hardware security, perhaps place it in the context of some of these broader policy documents that have been issued, and how you're seeing things unfold, particularly as you guys move towards implementation of the national cyber strategy.
Yeah, you bet. And maybe just a little bit of primer on national policy. You're hearing all these names of these strategies. I mean, every new administration creates a national security strategy. It paints a picture of how they see the US and the broader world. And then there's a nest of strategies that come from there. The national defense strategy, the national cyber strategy, which this is the second in a series of those. And oftentimes the DoD will put out a defense cyber strategy. So these strategies are informed by the president's top line steer in the national security strategy. And they add up to something, and they implement the president's vision. So in the national cybersecurity strategy, and kudos to the Office of National Cyber Director, who ran a very effective process in authoring that strategy. I was happy to be part of that and help get that across the goal line. There's a number of references to supply chain issues, and in particular, a theme that comes through is making sure that we rebalance kind of the responsibilities for security. One of the challenges in the past was that it seemed like the responsibility flows downhill and the end user is responsible for making sure that they are effectively defended, which is not exactly a fair fight when you're talking about nation state intelligence services and militaries are going after all manner of endpoint victims. And so we want to move higher up in the stack and make sure that the ecosystem enablers, your software makers, your cloud service providers, your telecom providers, that we're building in security at a higher level so that we can all be protected. So that's a central theme in there. And a lot of those references are around software security, and there will be other panels to talk about those. But there are a few references for hardware issues, and one of those in particular, and I'll plug a panel that's going to come tomorrow late in the morning, is on Internet of Things product security labeling. And so there's been a lot of work in the trade associations and the private sector and in the government around making that a reality. And there'll be a great conversation tomorrow afternoon. And I had previewed to the IoT advisory board the other day, that we were still on track to make an announcement in the spring. This was a commitment we made in October and at an event that we held at the White House, and we're on track. Now we have just a little bit more of spring left, so we're going to squeeze it in. So excited about that. But then there's also references in there to needing security in our mobile telecommunications stack, and with 5G and 6G to come, and making sure that we have vendor diversity and security. And so we've been championing the Open Radio Access Network approach, ORAN. And so that's an example of where we want to give countries and customers the ability to choose from a wider variety of vendors so that they can go with trusted vendors and don't necessarily have to be confronted with the choice of going with the cheap option or the expensive option with nothing in between, and the cheap option has some significant security risks built in. And so these are things that are weaved throughout the strategy, and as we go to implement those, like the IoT effort coming soon to a theater near you. I think that it's going to have an incredible impact on the ecosystem.
Wonderful. John, turning to you, maybe you can talk a little bit about how NIST is thinking about hardware security in the broader supply chain security context, and how the CHIPS Act the passage of the CHIPS Act has influenced NIST activities, if at all.
Right, certainly. So I mean, there's good news and bad news. The good news is I think supply chain attacks have been in the forefront, hit or miss over the last decade or so. It gets relevance and then it falls back. I think the sustained attention that we've had the last few years is probably good news, because I think we're doing a better job of securing our perimeter, so the attackers are going to the supply chain. Similarly, I think we're getting a little bit better. There's still a lot of software attacks out there, but the attackers are going deeper inside the platform stack. Mm-hmm. So that's where we're also headed in terms of our research. Now, again, I think we want to take a deliberative approach. We're kind of looking at it left of center or below the waterline. So we have systems and components that are out there. And right now we're looking at how to secure those systems and components as they are. NIST is doing a lot of research in building secure platforms in the hardware space, looking at using cryptographic measurement to verify the firmware and configurations, so that in terms of like hardware platforms, we have SP 1834 validating the hardware devices, mm-hmm. And looking at the when we're purchasing from a manufacturer, how can we validate that what we were purchasing is what we expected, right? And while we're using it, has it been changed? Has the configurations changed? Also, we've done other work in looking at hardware platforms in terms of NIST IR 8320, and looking at different architectural builds and how to validate the firmware and configurations through that manner. But that's one thing. What I think the CHIPS Act and the sustained focus on hardware security allows us to do is to move further down left and start looking at the metrology and security of like the design mm-hmm. system life cycle. And so we are touching in a lot of that space, but we don't want to get ahead of the curve, right? We don't want to, so we're kind of taking it slowly. We're looking at what work has been done out there, where the gaps are. There's a lot of research in this space, right? But a lot of those research can find attacks. What is the likelihood of those attacks in a real world? So this is kind of the things we're taking a look at right now.
And Amit, let me turn to you. I know you're still currently with Intel, so maybe you can share a little bit about how Intel is thinking about hardware security, and also how you're working with the U.S. government on some of their efforts.
Absolutely, and thank you, Steve, for mentioning the IoT panel. For those of you who are not going to have enough for me here, you are welcome to hear that panel. I think it's 125, I want to say, no.
Before lunch, I think.
Before lunch, 1:15. I missed in 10 minutes. Thank you, Mike. IoT tomorrow. I really appreciate that, because I want to connect here the dots. So we are hearing we are working a lot. These are my partners here. Everybody, I chair the ITI Cybersecurity Committee. We work very closely with NIST, and of course with Steve and the team in the White House, among others, on the IoT security labeling work. We have here a moment. We are hearing loud and clear from policymakers, from governments around the world, asking big entities, whoever is capable, that includes government, by the way, to take responsibility. That's the bottom line of the National Cybersecurity Strategy. Shift the responsibility to those who are most capable to protect risk. And in Intel, we are foundational for all these systems, right? Our stack is everywhere, from the space, from the satellites, to your PC, to the cloud. So that responsibility element, it's not just the $20 billion Intel is investing in Ohio to bring supply chain resilience back, right? We talked about the supply chain resilience, but it's also creating that stack that is better enabling all our partners, not just to have better security in terms of protecting data at use and confidential compute, not baseline measures, right? Top the line measures, but also to verify, right? John, you talked about it. The labeling program, certification, auditing, measurability of security. The other moment that we are hearing, and this is very prominent in the certification conversation, think about CMMC, think about FedRAMP, think about the EU Cyber Resilience Act, a move from self-attestation to security measurability. I looked at the expo, all the vendors, visualization of security. So for supply chain to be truly secure, we need to start thinking about security communication. This is the work done by NIST, among others, by CatMegs, and we just released the blog. What we do in terms of hardware is not just cooperating with our partners in public-private partnerships and sharing threat information and thinking about standards and priority international standards. It's thinking about a stack that not will just provide security, but allows you to verify. So just to put this in very concrete terms, one solution, transparent supply chain. We use our TPM, which is our silicon, to allow users of the vPro, the laptop, to verify if the BOM, the hardware BOM, the bill of materials, with the firmware of the entire laptop hasn't been tampered it from the moment that it left the manufacturing facility when you first boot it in collaboration with our partners. So this is how you use silicon, not just to protect, but to verify. I think that is going to be a lot of the future of supply chain and security, communication about security, transparency about security, fit to purpose, right communication to the right audience, and using technical measures for measurements.
Great, thank you. Another question that I wanted to hit on, looking specifically at the CHIPS Act and the notice of funding, you do see in there some discrete cybersecurity requirements that are associated with kind of disbursement of that funding and with getting approval. So, wanted to see if you could share perspectives on kind of how the legislation itself might help to advance cybersecurity in your view, as well as any additional kind of discrete actions, perhaps outside of the actual funding opportunity itself, that might be able to be taken in order to really move towards that improvement of hardware security beyond kind of what we've already covered.
Maybe I'll start, and then Amit has definitely a perspective on what it's requiring. But as a broader theme, one of the things that we've been looking at is making sure that when we make these massive investments, that we're inserting into those grant funds and opportunities requirements for security. And probably the biggest example is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Right. So between that, maybe a couple other things, I think there's about $1 trillion of infrastructure spending that's happening. And we're looking at each of the little discrete grant funding opportunities that are in there and figuring out where can we insert or encourage, either insert cybersecurity requirements into an OFO or to fund specifically cybersecurity activities. And this is for critical infrastructure. There definitely is a technical debt out there. In some sectors, there's kind of a lack of kind of expertise and capability, or the funding model of how a particular infrastructure service is provided, for instance, like drinking water. Adding a new requirement on is not exactly built in, because some of these are kind of regulated sectors where you have to go to a fee board to be able to approve a rate increase for whatever the unit of drinking water is. So making sure that we not only create mandates that there be security around critical infrastructure, but then find every way we can to help fund that work to be done. And in terms of, that's another theme of the cybersecurity strategy, it takes a more forward-leaning view on regulating cybersecurity into critical infrastructure, and everybody's seen the work by the TSA in rail, pipelines, and aviation. And EPA put out a new interpretive rule adding cybersecurity requirements into the sanitary survey system, which is a way that drinking water plants are inspected each year. And so we're going through, sector by sector, looking to see where we have authorities. And a big piece of that is making sure that how we deploy our money that there's cybersecurity requirements and the opportunity to invest in cybersecurity in those. And the CHIPS Act is certainly a feature of that.
Sure. Amit, did you want to kind of share perspectives either specifically on chips or more broadly kind of how you're
Yeah.
seeing this?
I mean, I will say we are all working on the notice of proposed funding. You know, this is the this is the vehicle, right, that looks into how NIST will distribute the funding on the CHIPS Act, and you know, cybersecurity is in it. You know, one of the criteria is how entities that are looking for funding. I think there is a large amount of you know, entities that are now engaged in this. Of course, Intel included, and one of the criteria is how do you have measures to address vulnerabilities and mitigate vulnerabilities that are aligned with standards and best practices as they evolve, including the NIST cybersecurity framework that is now in revision, including the CISA performance goals. And you know, part of what we do at Intel is we design architectures to protect against supply chain security attacks, and we remediate vulnerabilities at hardware, and we have large teams of hackers within Intel and collaborate with external friendly hackers via our bug bounty and private bug bounty and academic collaborations to try to do the best we can, right? The attackers are always going to be there, right, to work on these issues. And of course, we have our best practice when it comes to addressing, you know, nation state and cyber attacks when it comes to our fabs and facilities. So we take an holistic view of security, which by the way includes people and workforce. And that's part of what we are bringing, that kind of point of view to the table. And we think about security exactly like NIST and NSC. You see that across the board. Security is holistic. It's never just the architecture. It's never just the risk processes. It's never just one piece of the stack. And that's the kind of point of view we would like to see as we move forward with this. And again, I will say it again because it's important. We won't forget it. People, workforce, diversity. So yes, we are also investing in how can we educate the future talent for semiconductors and cyber workforce, not just in top tier universities, that too, in community colleges. So that part of it's not just technical debt, because it's not just going to be technology that will solve our issues, it's also people. So I think that's the piece that I would like to kind of emphasize here, and that's part of, you know, I leave Intel, you know, really inspired by all the leadership we have there, because you know, this is a piece of the puzzle, right? How do we also invest in people?
Sure. And John, maybe more broadly from your perspective, Amit mentioned the revision of the cybersecurity framework. I know you guys are thinking about how supply chain security might fit in there more holistically. So, you know, wondering if you can share a little bit more around that and kind of how you guys are thinking through supply chain security in the context of broader cyber risk management.
Yeah, no, thank you. You know, over the last year and a half, we've engaged public, and I think there are at least two-thirds of the folks that have made comments on the cybersecurity framework said that we should integrate supply chain risk management inside. So we're in the process of doing that. I believe if it hasn't already been released, it should be shortly, but a draft core of showing how we've integrated that. But on a separate note, but similar, I think frameworks in terms of communicating the security and the supply chain risk postures is key. So a lot of that, the CSF is really focused on an organization's how it manages its risk. But there's also other frameworks. If you look at some of the work the DoD is doing right now in Section 224, I think it is the NDAA 2020 maybe, or 2019, is one of those. But developing standards for microelectronics. And one of the things that I think they've discovered is that there are a lot of gaps in the standards area. So what they're doing is creating a framework, right? So frameworks like this, the CSF, other frameworks, they allow organizations to not just point to standards, but to point to best practices, point to even you know, their internal secret sauce if they have to. But it's communicating those security and how they're managing that risk that's key.
Makes sense. You know, Amit, you already kind of mentioned this at the start of the conversation, but you mentioned the EU CRA, for example, and the importance of taking an approach that is globally aligned and avoiding fragmentation. We know, U.S. efforts are not happening in a vacuum, and so wondered if you could talk a little bit about, what you're seeing unfold at the global level. And Steve, welcome your perspectives on how you're seeking to kind of engage international partners as you're thinking through, approaches to hardware security. But would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I appreciate that, and I really want to level set in a second. When I mean this is a moment for product security, is I want to take a lot of conversations we have been hearing for a long time and put them together, right? So in the world of policy, right, policy makers' action and regulation often reflects a societal concern. A societal concerns reflects, people, users, industry, hackers, everyone. So in the aftermath of the Mirai botnet, how many of you are familiar with the botnet? Pretty significant, right? Default password had a small part to do with it, right? We have seen a wave of IoT security regulation. California 327, UK, work on certifications, Singapore, the list goes on. But these legislations focused on reasonable security measures with the focus on the default password. The device should not have a default password as a reasonable security. Now we are approaching a moment on what we call baseline security measures. That's the Secure by Design statement that we have seen from CISA in collaboration with 5i Plus and many others. That's the initiative you're going to hear about hopefully tomorrow if you join us. That's connected also to the amazing work by NIST on NIST 8259, the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act. By the way, if you forgot, all IoT devices procured by federal government very soon are going to be required to have a list of processes and features. Introducing NIST 800-213A. I know it's a lot of numbers, but really important. All this work is converging to this moment on the product security regulation. So what's happening is Europe has proposed a very ambitious regulation. Think about like GDPR +++ for product. It's still a negotiation. It's in what we call the trilogue process. But all products coming into Europe will not be entering the customs, CE mark enforcement, if they don't have a set of what we call cyber essential requirements. There are also incident response requirement and SBOM and all sorts of requirements. And these are sets of on-device features that every connected product, which is defined broadly right now, by the way, to also include software, yes, I know, and processes that come with these features. Do you have a capability to support updates? But how long are you going to support it? Do you have a capability for unique authentication? Do you have capability for data at rest and in transit? And we at Intel think also in use should be part of the CRA. That's the level of granularity of the cyber essential requirements in Annex 1 to the CRA that is going to be probably in effect around 2027. But that technical feature conversation has been happening in standards, preparing for this moment. So when we think about product security, because everything is connected, we have a global picture and the technical interface to support it. CTA here in the room, NIST. I myself am a co-editor of an ISO 27 series standard almost done in this 27402. All these standards are going to come together, right, to hopefully form a more cohesive approach to this management. But here's the key point, Courtney. It's important. As we think about those IoT devices, we're not going to have the same features for the smart dog collar. Yes, Mike, I still have your example. And the MRI machine and the grid in the nuclear power station. As we create baseline and take everybody up to protect users, we should be mindful that it's truly risk-based. So for the higher risk, OT, we don't just do 624 for free and the standards, but high protection. And I think this is a very important call to action for the community, because baseline is important, but we should also strive to take the baseline up and up and up, and for higher risk, better than baseline.
Sure. Steve, did you have any thoughts kind of on the international component to this conversation?
Yes, absolutely. We want to make sure that we're breaking down barriers, not balkanizing markets. And so it's really important, the work of NIST and the work of all the standards bodies and the work of the trade associations I think we're iterating towards kind of
Convergence.
a common kind of security posture for classes of device, because we want US manufacturers to have access to the world and for their products to be available everywhere and recognized as well. Other countries that are producing safe and secure products, we want the US to be a welcoming market to them as well. So I think that this is an exciting time, a lot of wonderful work, and that there's not some kind of divide between policymakers that sit in high towers and then out of the chimney comes white smoke, that we've made a decision. It's the conversations with the line level practitioners, the product designers, the companies, the nonprofits, the industry associations, and it all comes together into, hopefully we can come up with good security and privacy policy that's going to make the world a better place.
And usable.
Yes,
Usable.
indeed, important. John, any thoughts to add on that point?
Well, you say standards. I would be remiss if I didn't say something about standards.
Fair
But
enough.
no, I think, if you look at the National Cyber Strategy and the way it's structured and the international sections on it and supply chain, I think this is a perfect opportunity because supply chain risk management, we've done a lot of work over the last decade plus. The standards and guidelines are out there for organizations to use. I think we're at a point in time where there's a lot of training and awareness to happen. There's a lot of awareness about risk, supply chain risk, but also internationally, right? Supply chains are global. So we need to start working with our partners and get kind of a common set of understanding and practices and standards globally to be used to make our supply chains more resilient and secure. So I think this is a perfect inflection point to start doing that.
And some of those conversations are happening, absolutely. In fact, the US-EU Trade and Technology Council is one place where those are happening, from technical products to rare earth minerals, my earlier example. So it's absolutely happening.
In a way, our common focus right now is just to fit it. So we want to make sure that all the work that is being done, NIST 8259, the work by NIST, the work at ISO, the work at ETSI, those sectorial standards, the work done in NSC, we are just trying to make sure that we don't have fragmentation and regulation that blocks our right-to-use standard. And it's perfectly fine that Europe might have a more comprehensive approach than the US. It's very common if you think about GDPR. Maybe in the way you attest, maybe in the different scope. But we gotta make sure that the baseline of the technical features does not conflict to promote design neutrality, so when the next stage of attacks in 5 years are coming, we can fix technical standards, I want to say very fast, but a little faster. Regulation takes a little bit more time.
Absolutely. So I want to offer the audience opportunities to ask questions. So I'm going to ask all of my panelists one final question, and then if folks in the audience have questions for the panel, I think there's a couple microphones stationed around the room. Would love to take questions from you all. So please feel free to get in line or what have you. But maybe a final question for you all. Steve, would love to hear a little bit about what's next. Like, what are you thinking from the USG perspective is going to be the most important kind of driving activity or effort moving forward? Amit, from your perspective, kind of how are you thinking about industry and standards and what needs to happen in order to really facilitate this move? And then John, from your perspective, kind of what's next for NIST?
Okay, so I'll be really quick. And I thought that ending with making the world a better place was good enough. But
However.
The National Cyber Strategy, you publish a strategy. The work is not over. In fact, the work is only beginning. It takes a lot to get that done, but there's many, many activities that need to be carried out. Some of these things are long-term conversation starters. Other things are very tangible, and you'll see results in the short term. And so, that's what we're focused on right now. And of course, there's been lots of interest around AI and what does U.S. government think about that. So you can just rest assured there's a lot of conversations happening on that topic as well. So there's plenty of work for people like me.
Amit?
You're asking what's next. I'm a little bit in stealth, but since this is RSA, I completely trust our audience, right? This is all based on security. I'll share a little bit what's next. These conversations are really important and they need to happen, but they cannot just happen with the same people in the same room. on like just in areas like this. So what inspires me when I'm creating open policy is to truly democratize policy. In a way, we can have conversations like this with better access to everyone. Small enterprise, nonprofits, academia, at scales, conversations about all the pieces, technologies, standards, best practices, global regulations. That's where I hope that's at least where I'm going to focus, to not just promote the IoT and hardware security conversation, but the platform on which all the future conversations can happen. Because here's the key. You were here at RSA 3 years ago where you heard from a panel about open source security, or SolarWinds, or Log4j. The attackers are always ahead. We're going to have new attacks, and it's always the same message. For this to work, we need collaborations, conversations between hackers and policymakers and standard bodies and industry, and everybody needs to work together. So to address the attacks, we're going to always have new technologies, new innovations, new standards, new regulations. What we can do collaboratively is create a platform where these conversations can be informed from all perspectives. So that's what's next for me.
Thanks, Amit. John, final thoughts?
I'm going to try to make the world a better place and more secure, meantime, but I'm going to need everyone's help. So you're now enlisted to the cause.
So can't compare to that again, but so again with the National Cyber Strategy and the CHIPS Act out there, this offers at least NIST a sustained objective and approach to be able to build our capability and resources into kind of going below the waterline where we traditionally haven't. So we're going to be making new friends and connections and collaborating in different areas where we haven't yet, right? With a lot of the academia and researchers and a lot of the companies where, in different parts of the companies, right? Where we really haven't engaged before. So, I'm really excited about the next 3 to 5 years and where this is gonna take us.
Wonderful. If folks in the audience have questions, we'd love to hear them. I will give people an opportunity to stand up and get to the mics. All right, I think I saw you coming down first, and then we'll go over on
They're
the
leaving
side.
and they're not coming back to the IoT panel.
So, hi, my name's Matthew, and Courtney, I know you pretty well. I met you and I have had many conversations on this topic. So, you bring up a really good point. Cyber Resiliency Act, there's lots of regulations around the globe that are impacting everybody. I work for one of the larger global manufacturing, global automation companies in the world. One of the struggles we face is standardization and collaboration. That's been an ongoing challenge. GDPR, again, represents that great program. And we look at how it's disconnected in the US. With the Cyber Resiliency Act and these other things, I'd be interested in understanding specifically, John and Steve in particular, what are you guys looking at in that context, that frameworks that are being proposed by the Europeans, and looking at what we're doing in the US to help at least align or even index against that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Our system of government offers fewer opportunities to create broad sweeping regimes like they do in Europe. They've gotten actually pretty good at that. These things take a while to work through, but they do get across the goal line. In the US, for instance, with data breach reporting, we're still in a position where there's 50, however many states and territories we have, 54 different regimes. And so they've not been superseded by one national approach. It's challenging. I think that there are areas where, given the time it takes for the Europeans to get something across the goal line, if we're engaged heavily in working on complementary activities, and product security is one of those examples, I think that we will probably end up at the end of the process at the same point where we're achieving the same ends. Hopefully.
Hopefully the ISO will be adopted as an ETSI. That's
Yes.
all we need.
So I cannot guarantee that somebody in Congress is going to propose a similar CRA, and we would have equivalent national laws. That is unknowable. But absolutely, the more that we're having conversations with our European counterparts and lawmakers and regulators in other countries, I think we're going to iterate towards common solutions.
I would just say I think standards is the key. The Europeans really like to focus on the standards and international standards, and we have some frameworks, and at least the cybersecurity framework is a international standard. But I think there's other places where we can go to try to reach that equivalency through standards. But it is working with the European Commission.
I want to comment on this real quick because I think we talk a lot about harmonization and alignment and et cetera. This is really, I don't want to say it's really simple, but there have been a lot of work already on the technical standards for IoT security. Just Google baseline security measures for IoT. I see here Mike in the room. You created a consensus for the technical baseline in 2018. I started to work on 2742 as a co-editor with Elaine Newton, and of course with contribution from NIST and others in 2018. This is an important note. The reason it is so important to think about standards is because in Europe, standards are the law based on an ECJ decision. So the way Europe assesses compliance largely is based on what we call harmonized norms, which includes in many cases standards. The only question is, are these standards that are, by the way, developed by free organizations only, ETSI, CENELAC, and CENELAC, are going to be duplicative, fragmented, or developed in collaboration with other places? We do standards on the global level with global participation like ISO. And you can take an ISO and adopt it as an EN. Our current concern is that we create a framework within the CRA that we can simply fit the standards and encourage their adoption so we don't start from scratch for users. Because understand, if we have a situation where we need to start developing standards from scratch, and we had that with the Radio Equipment Directive, and it didn't work, okay? Or we had some challenges, at least that's why we're delaying the Radio Equipment Directive security and privacy compliance. In the end, users are not getting these protections in time, and industry doesn't get enough time to prepare. So if I can leave you with a message, the National Cybersecurity Strategy is a very important document. Everything we're doing in legislations and laws is really important. But we need your help also in actually also engaging on technical standards. Yeah. And I would say something as an editor. It's not glorious. It's Zoom calls in the middle of the night. It's hard. It's consensus building for years. But that work is important. And we, with NIST, right, cultivating standards, as industry, we at Intel invest a lot of time supporting that. And this is where we also need engagement and support from the community.
Couldn't agree with you more. Cybersecurity is a team sport.
All right, we have just a couple minutes left. I want to be mindful of time. I know you were waiting, so we'll go to you. And then if we don't have time for any other questions, a couple of us can stand around, or otherwise you can find us afterwards.
Yeah. I'm hearing a lot about the standards, but I think one of the things that we're missing here is that the chip manufacturers themselves are trying to differentiate each other. And even though we have maybe a common operating system above them, the chips themselves are many ways proprietary to their system. And they have many, Intel is a good example of having a lot of functionalities. ARM is another example, have a lot of functionality that other chips don't have. Mm-hmm. And operating systems will take advantage of that system. Are you suggesting that the standards will replace these proprietary systems, or is there another approach?
I'm going to take that. Well, again, I'm leaving Intel soon, but what I can tell you from the 4 years at Intel, and by the way, I'm a principal engineer, it's pretty strange because I'm also a lawyer. They're like, she's a hacker, she's a lawyer, she's an engineer, unclear, okay. So we, if you look at Pat Gelsinger and Greg Lavender vision, and the reason why I'm spending time editing on international standards is because of our importance towards openness and open source and engagement, right? It takes a lot of time, right, for Intel personnel to engage in standards, and we do it. If you look at what we're doing in confidential compute, for example, we're doing a lot of open source engagements, and so our goal is, every system, every architecture is going to be there are going to be elements that are proprietary. But our goal with our approach, if you look at what we're doing at open source security, by the way, Intel is, I think, top 10 open source security software provider in the world. I know you think Intel, you think hardware, but we spend a lot of time enabling our hardware. As is, we enable those proprietary features, even if the architecture is closer, we create openness, right, to allow everyone to participate. And that's honestly why I joined Intel, right? And I'm a little bit bummed about leaving that behind, but I can truly say this is a company that is about the stack, the community, openness, and culture.
All right, unfortunately, I think we've reached the end of our time. I'm sorry about that. Please feel free to catch us afterwards. Thank you all again for being here today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your RSA conference and have a good rest of your day.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Please exit the room so that our staff can come in and clean. Please allow the speakers to de-mic. And if you have questions for them, please take them outside. Thank you.
How are you?